On a quiet summer night in 1912, the small town of Villisca, Iowa, went to sleep believing it was safe. It was the kind of town where doors were rarely locked, where neighbors knew each other by name, and where violence was something that happened elsewhere in distant cities, not on tree-lined streets lit by oil lamps. The population barely exceeded 1,200 people, and life moved at a predictable, almost comforting pace. That sense of certainty would be shattered before dawn. The Moore family lived in a modest white house on 2nd Street, not far from the center of town. Josiah Moore was a well-known and respected businessman, co-owner of a local agricultural equipment company. He was 43 years old, reliable, church-going, and ambitious in a quiet Midwestern way. His wife, Sarah, was 39, described by neighbors as kind, reserved, and deeply devoted to her children. Together they had 4 children: Herman, 11, Catherine, 10, Boyd, 7, and Paul, 5. Their lives revolved around school, church, chores, and the routines common to families of that era. On Sunday, June 9, 1912, the day before the murders, Villisca followed its usual rhythm. That evening, Josiah and Sarah took their children to the local Presbyterian church to attend a Children's Day program. It was a warm night, and the church was full of families and familiar faces. 2 other children attended the service as well: Lena and Ina Stillinger, sisters aged 12 and 8. After the program ended, the Moore children invited the Stillinger girls to spend the night at their house. The invitation was innocent, ordinary, the kind of spontaneous decision that no one would later remember as significant until it was far too late. By around 9:30 p.m., the Moore family and their guests had returned home. According to later reconstructions, Josiah checked the doors and windows as he usually did, though there was no indication he did so with any particular concern. The family prepared for bed. The children went upstairs to sleep, while Josiah and Sarah retired to their bedroom on the 1st floor. The house settled into silence. Sometime after midnight, an unknown individual entered the Moore residence. To this day, no one knows exactly how the killer got inside. There were no signs of forced entry. Some investigators believed the door was unlocked, as was common at the time. Others suggested the killer may have had access to a key, or that he entered through an unlocked window. What is known is that the intruder moved through the house with a disturbing degree of familiarity and confidence. The weapon used was an axe, later identified as belonging to Josiah Moore. It had been stored either in the barn or inside the house. The killer did not bring a weapon with him. He used what was already there. This detail would later trouble investigators deeply, suggesting either opportunity, planning, or both. The murders began upstairs where the children slept. Herman, Catherine, Boyd, Paul, Lena, and Ina were all killed in their beds. Medical examinations revealed that the attacks were brutal and swift. In most cases, the blunt side of the axe was used, not the blade. The blows were powerful enough to fracture skulls and cause instant or near-instant death. There was no evidence that the children had a chance to escape. After killing the children upstairs, the killer descended the staircase and entered the bedroom where Josiah and Sarah slept. They, too, were struck repeatedly with the axe. Josiah's wounds were severe, his face unrecognizable. Sarah appeared to have defensive injuries, suggesting she may have woken briefly and attempted to shield herself. It did not save her. What followed the murders is one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. The killer did not flee immediately. Instead, he remained inside the house for an unknown period of time. He covered the victims' faces with bed sheets and clothing, a gesture that has been interpreted in various ways: remorse, ritual, or a desire not to see what he had done. He covered mirrors and windows with cloth. He even prepared food in the kitchen, eating slices of bacon and possibly washing his hands before leaving. This behavior suggested calm, control, and an absence of panic. Just before dawn, the killer vanished into the early morning light, leaving behind one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history. The bodies were discovered later that morning by a neighbor, Mary Peckett, who had become concerned when the Moore family failed to come outside as usual. Josiah was known to be punctual, and by mid-morning, his absence was noticeable. Mary asked Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, to accompany her to the house. They knocked, received no answer, and eventually entered. What they found defied comprehension. Ross Moore encountered the bodies of the children upstairs. Overcome with shock, he staggered back down the stairs, shouting for help. Word spread quickly. Villisca's peace shattered in a matter of minutes as neighbors, officials, and onlookers flooded the property. The town marshal, Henry Horton, arrived and attempted to secure the scene, but he was quickly overwhelmed. In 1912, crime scene preservation was poorly understood. Curious townspeople entered the house freely. They touched objects, moved furniture, and in some cases even handled the bodies. Journalists arrived from nearby cities, trampling through the rooms. Whatever forensic evidence might have existed was compromised almost immediately. Despite this, certain details were recorded. The axe used in the murders was found leaning against a wall, partially cleaned. Bloodstains were visible throughout the house, though much of the blood had been absorbed by bedding and clothing. A slab of raw bacon was discovered wrapped in a dish towel in the kitchen. The telephone line had been cut, suggesting at least some degree of premeditation. As news spread, Villisca became the center of national attention. Newspapers across the United States carried headlines describing the Axe Murders in chilling detail. Comparisons were drawn to other unsolved axe killings that had occurred in the Midwest and South during the early 20th century. Fear rippled outward, transforming a local tragedy into a broader symbol of vulnerability. Almost immediately, investigators began searching for a suspect. The list of possibilities grew rapidly, but solid evidence was scarce. Everyone in town seemed to know everyone else, and suspicion spread like a disease. One of the first suspects was Frank Jones, a former business partner of Josiah Moore. The two men had dissolved their partnership under tense circumstances, and rumors of animosity were common. Some believed Jones had threatened Josiah in the past. His name dominated early headlines, and public opinion quickly turned against him. However, no physical evidence tied Jones to the crime, and his alibi, while imperfect, could not be disproven. Another suspect was Reverend George Kelly, a traveling preacher who had been in Villisca around the time of the murders. Kelly was known for erratic behavior and disturbing sermons that fixated on sexuality and punishment. He had attended the same church service as the Moore family on the night of the murders and had asked strange questions afterward. Investigators later learned that Kelly had a history of mental illness. He was arrested, interrogated, and at one point even confessed. But his confession was riddled with inconsistencies and was ultimately deemed unreliable. He recanted, claiming coercion, and no physical evidence placed him inside the Moore house. As the investigation dragged on, public frustration grew. Each new theory seemed promising at first, only to collapse under scrutiny. The lack of forensic science in 1912 meant investigators relied heavily on witness statements, rumors, and circumstantial evidence. Memory blurred. Stories changed. Time worked against the truth. Meanwhile, Villisca itself began to change. The Moore house stood empty, its windows dark, its presence a constant reminder of what had happened. People avoided walking past it at night. Some claimed to see lights inside when no one was there. Others reported sounds, footsteps, whispers. Whether these experiences were psychological or something more is impossible to say. But the house quickly gained a reputation as a place touched by darkness. Years passed, and the case grew colder. Official investigations stalled. Grand juries were convened, suspects questioned, then released. No one was ever convicted. The murders of Josiah and Sarah Moore, their 4 children, and the Stillinger sisters remained officially unsolved. Yet the story did not fade. Instead, it hardened into legend, fueled by unanswered questions and the sheer brutality of the crime. Why this family? Why these children? Why an axe taken from the house itself? Why the deliberate, almost ceremonial behavior after the killings? Each generation would reinterpret the case through the lens of its own fears. To some, it was a story of personal revenge. To others, the work of a wandering killer. To still others, something darker and less rational. What remains undeniable is that on one night in June 1912, evil entered a quiet Iowa home and rewrote the history of an entire town. And more than a century later, the Villisca Axe Murders continue to resist explanation, standing as one of America's most chilling and enduring true crime mysteries. As weeks turned into months, the initial shock of the Villisca murders slowly transformed into something heavier and more corrosive: unresolved fear. The town attempted to resume normal life, but normal no longer meant the same thing. Doors were locked now. Lamps stayed lit longer into the night. Parents watched their children with an attention that bordered on obsession. The idea that the killer had never been identified created a constant, low-level anxiety that never fully went away. The official investigation, such as it was, continued in fits and starts. Law enforcement at the time lacked centralized coordination, modern forensic techniques, and standardized procedures. Each new lead was pursued with urgency, then abandoned when it failed to produce immediate results. The crime scene, already badly compromised on the first day, offered little physical evidence to revisit. No usable fingerprints, no blood trail leading away from the house, no reliable eyewitnesses who could place a specific individual at the scene during the crucial hours. What investigators did have was behavior, and the behavior of the killer, reconstructed from the scene, was deeply unsettling. The fact that the murders began upstairs suggested a calculated approach. The killer neutralized the most vulnerable occupants first, eliminating the possibility of escape or resistance. The order implied planning, not impulse. The use of the blunt end of the axe reduced noise and mess, indicating a desire to maintain control. The covering of faces afterward suggested something more psychological, possibly symbolic. And the decision to remain inside the house afterward, preparing food, washing up, even closing curtains, suggested an individual who felt no immediate urgency to flee. This was not a crime of panic. This profile led some investigators to theorize that the killer may have been familiar with the family, or at least comfortable moving through domestic spaces. Others believed the killer had committed similar crimes before and had developed a ritualized method. This theory gained traction when journalists and amateur detectives began comparing the Villisca murders to a series of unsolved axe attacks across the Midwest and southern United States during the early 1900s. In several cases, entire families were murdered in their sleep. In many of them, an axe was used. In some, mirrors were covered and victims' faces hidden. While no definitive connection was ever proven, the similarities were difficult to ignore. The idea of a roaming axe murderer, moving from town to town, preying on sleeping families, captured the public imagination and amplified the fear surrounding the Villisca case. Inside Villisca, suspicion became personal. Frank Jones remained a central figure in local gossip. Although never charged, he was never truly cleared in the minds of many townspeople. His former business relationship with Josiah Moore had ended badly, and resentment was widely rumored. Some claimed Jones had hired someone to commit the murders, allowing him to maintain plausible deniability. Others believed he had orchestrated the crime but avoided direct involvement. None of these theories were supported by hard evidence, but in a town desperate for answers, suspicion filled the gaps where facts were missing. Jones eventually moved away from Villisca, but his shadow lingered. Reverend George Kelly, meanwhile, became the most formally investigated suspect. His behavior continued to disturb those who examined the case. Kelly had reportedly loitered near the Moore house on the night of the murders. He was known to carry an axe with him during his travels, claiming it was for protection. He had asked to stay overnight at the church on the same evening as the crime, and he had a documented history of mental instability. When Kelly was arrested in 1917, 5 years after the murders, investigators believed they were finally close to solving the case. During interrogation, Kelly made statements that appeared to implicate himself. He spoke of dreams, visions, and religious compulsion. At one point, he gave a confession that seemed detailed enough to be convincing. But the confession did not hold. Under closer examination, Kelly's statements were inconsistent. He described details that did not match the crime scene and failed to provide information that only the killer would know. His confession appeared to be the result of intense pressure, exhaustion, and suggestion. When the case went to trial in 1917, Kelly was acquitted. The jury found the evidence insufficient and unreliable. Once again, Villisca was left without justice. The acquittal deepened the town's sense of abandonment. Many believed the legal system had failed them. Others believed the wrong man had been accused while the real killer walked free. Trust in authorities eroded. Rumors hardened into beliefs. At the same time, the Moore house itself took on a new role in the story. Vacant and silent, it became an object of fascination. Some families refused to live there. Those who did reported strange experiences. Unexplained noises, the sound of children crying, the feeling of being watched. While skeptics dismissed these accounts as the natural result of fear and suggestion, they persisted for decades. By the mid-20th century, the house was widely regarded as haunted. Researchers, writers, and paranormal investigators began visiting Villisca, each hoping to uncover something overlooked. Some focused on archival documents, newspaper clippings, and court records. Others conducted seances, recordings, and overnight stays. The line between historical investigation and legend blurred. But even stripped of myth, the core facts remained disturbing. 8 people had been murdered in their sleep. The killer had used a household tool. He had stayed inside the house afterward. He had escaped without leaving a trace. And no one had ever been held accountable. Modern criminologists who later reviewed the case noted patterns consistent with what would now be described as a serial offender. The lack of sexual assault suggested a different motivation, possibly power, control, or compulsion. The careful staging of the scene suggested ritual behavior. The choice of victims, including children, indicated an absence of empathy and an ability to emotionally detach. Still, without DNA, fingerprints, or reliable witnesses, these analyses remained theoretical. As decades passed, the murders became embedded in American true crime history. The story was retold in books, documentaries, and lectures. Each retelling emphasized different aspects: the brutality, the mystery, the suspected suspects, the haunted house. But none could provide a definitive answer to the central question: who did it? Some believed the truth had been lost forever, buried under compromised evidence and forgotten testimony. Others believed the answer was always there, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be recognized. What made the Villisca case endure was not just the violence, but the uncertainty. The lack of resolution left a psychological wound that never fully healed. Unlike cases where a perpetrator is identified and punished, Villisca offered no closure. The story simply stopped mid-sentence, leaving generations to fill in the ending themselves. For the families of the victims, this uncertainty was devastating. Relatives grew old and died without knowing who had destroyed their loved ones. The Moore children and the Stillinger sisters became names frozen in time, forever associated with the way they died rather than the lives they lived. And yet, the town of Villisca survived. Life continued. New families moved in. Businesses opened and closed. Children were born who would later grow up hearing whispers about the house on 2nd Street. The murders became part of the town's identity, an unchosen legacy passed down through stories and warnings. In quiet moments, the questions lingered. Why did the killer choose that night? Why that family? Why stay inside afterward? And how did he vanish so completely? These questions, unanswered for more than a century, continue to pull people back into the story. Because the Villisca Axe Murders are not just a historical crime. They are a reminder of how fragile certainty can be, how quickly safety can dissolve, and how some crimes refuse to be explained, no matter how much time passes. And somewhere between fact and legend, between evidence and imagination, the truth remains, waiting in silence. For more than a century, that silence has invited speculation. And as time moved forward, investigators, historians, and criminologists began to look back at the Villisca Axe murders with new questions, new frameworks, and a growing sense that the truth, while elusive, might still be partially reconstructed through behavior, timing, and motive rather than physical evidence. One of the most persistent lines of inquiry focused on motive. The brutality of the crime suggested intense violence, yet there was no sign of robbery. Money and valuables were left untouched. The family was not wealthy enough to attract criminal attention, but not poor enough to be overlooked. This ruled out simple financial gain and pushed investigators toward more personal or psychological explanations. Revenge was one of the earliest theories. The strained relationship between Josiah Moore and Frank Jones continued to haunt the case. Their dissolved business partnership had left bitterness on both sides. Rumors circulated that Jones had threatened Josiah in the past, though no witness ever testified to hearing a direct threat. Jones's political influence in the area further complicated matters. Some believed this influence shielded him from deeper scrutiny. Others argued that his visibility made him an unlikely perpetrator. Modern analysts tend to view the Jones theory with caution. While motive may have existed, the logistics of the crime raise questions. Hiring someone to murder an entire family, including children and unrelated guests, would have required a level of detachment and risk that seems extreme even by the standards of personal vendetta. And no financial or testimonial trail ever emerged to support the idea of a hired killer. Another line of thought focused on opportunity rather than motive. The killer appeared to know the layout of the house. He moved through it in darkness without apparent difficulty. He knew where the axe was stored. He knew which rooms were occupied. This suggested familiarity either with the house itself or with homes of that type. Some believed the killer may have been a local laborer, possibly someone who had worked on the house or nearby properties. Others suggested a transient individual who had spent time in similar homes and understood their predictable layouts. This brought renewed attention to the idea of a traveling offender. Between the late 1890s and the early 1910s, a series of axe murders occurred across the United States. In cities like New Orleans, families were attacked at night, often without sexual assault or robbery. In some cases, victims' faces were covered. In others, the killer lingered at the scene. While the details varied, the similarities were unsettling enough that some researchers proposed the existence of an early serial killer, long before the term existed. If Villisca was part of this pattern, it would explain several key elements: the lack of a clear local motive, the absence of a known suspect, and the killer's ability to vanish without trace. A transient offender would not have been embedded in the community. He would have left town immediately, blending into rail traffic or rural routes. And in 1912, tracking such movement was nearly impossible. Reverend George Kelly fits partially into this framework, which is why his name continues to resurface. He was transient. He was present in Villisca. He displayed troubling behavior. and he made statements that, at least superficially, suggested guilt. However, modern psychological evaluations of his interrogation transcripts indicate that Kelly was highly suggestible. His confession appears to reflect what investigators wanted to hear rather than what he actually knew. In other words, Kelly may have been disturbed, but that does not make him the killer. Another suspect, less well-known but equally controversial, was a man named William Mansfield. Mansfield was related by marriage to Senator Frank F. Jones and had a criminal history. He was suspected in several other axe murders and was known to travel extensively. At one point, he was arrested in connection with the Villisca murders, but the charges were dropped due to lack of evidence. Like so many others, his name joined the long list of possibilities without resolution. What makes Mansfield interesting to some modern researchers is not just his background, but the timing of his movements. Records suggest he may have been in the region around the time of the murders. However, records from that era are incomplete, and the trail goes cold quickly. As the decades passed, the investigation transitioned from active pursuit to historical analysis. Without living witnesses or recoverable evidence, the case became a puzzle rather than a prosecution. Each new generation brought its own tools and assumptions. In the late 20th century, criminal profilers revisited the case using behavioral analysis. They focused less on individual suspects and more on the psychology of the crime itself. Their conclusions were unsettling but consistent. The killer was likely male. He was likely comfortable with violence. He showed signs of organization rather than impulsivity. He exhibited control over the environment and the victims. The lack of sexual assault did not indicate absence of sexual motivation, but rather a displacement of it into power and domination. The covering of faces suggested either guilt or ritual, possibly an attempt to depersonalize the victims after the act. The choice to kill children, including 2 unrelated guests, suggested that the killer's objective was not tied to a specific individual alone. This was not simply about Josiah Moore. This was about the act itself. And then there is the matter of time. The killer had hours. He moved through the house methodically. He prepared food. He washed up. He did not rush. This implies confidence and a belief that he would not be interrupted. Either he knew the household schedule intimately, or he was experienced enough to trust his own process. This level of calm points away from spontaneous rage and toward compulsion. Some researchers have suggested that the murders occurred over multiple phases of the night, with pauses in between. This would mean the killer remained inside the house even longer than originally assumed. If true, it raises profound questions about the killer's mental state and sense of entitlement within the space. Meanwhile, the town of Villisca continued to live with the consequences. The Moore house changed hands several times. Owners came and went. Some stayed only briefly, unable to tolerate the atmosphere. Others reported disturbances that defied explanation. Children complained of nightmares. Adults described feelings of dread. Whether these experiences were psychological or environmental is impossible to determine, but the pattern was consistent enough to fuel the house's reputation. By the early 2000s, the house had been restored to its 1912 appearance and opened to the public as a historical site. Visitors could walk through the rooms, see the beds, stand in the spaces where the murders occurred. Some came out of historical interest. Others came seeking something more intangible. Overnight stays became common. Paranormal investigators brought equipment, cameras, and recorders. They reported sounds, movements, voices. Skeptics dismissed these claims, pointing to the power of suggestion in a location so heavily charged with narrative. But even skeptics acknowledged the emotional weight of the space. What makes Villisca unique is not just that the murders remain unsolved, but that they resist simplification. There is no single theory that explains all aspects of the crime. Each explanation answers some questions while creating others. If it was a local crime, why was there no credible evidence? If it was a traveling killer, why did the pattern stop? If it was personal, why kill everyone? If it was random, why the ritual behavior? These contradictions keep the case alive that in modern true crime culture, Villisca stands as an early example of something that would become far more common in the 20th century: the unsolved mass murder. It forces us to confront the limits of investigation, the fragility of certainty, and the uncomfortable truth that not all crimes yield answers. For the victims, this lack of resolution is the final injustice. They exist in history only through the lens of their deaths. The Moore children never grew up. The Stillinger sisters never returned home. Josiah and Sarah Moore never saw justice. And yet, their story continues to matter. It matters because it exposes the gap between what we want to know and what we can know. It matters because it reminds us that evil does not always announce itself, and that safety is often an illusion maintained by routine and trust. And it matters because even in the absence of answers, the questions themselves shape how we understand violence, responsibility, and memory. As the years pass, the likelihood of definitive resolution grows smaller. Physical evidence has long since degraded. Suspects are dead. Witnesses are gone. What remains are records, interpretations, and a house that refuses to let the story fade. The Villisca Axe murders endure not because they are sensational, but because they are incomplete. They end without explanation, without justice, without closure. And in that unfinished ending, they continue to haunt not just a town, but anyone who tries to understand what happened on that quiet summer night in 1912. That haunting incompleteness is ultimately what gives the Villisca Axe murders their enduring power. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the case no longer belonged to investigators alone. It became a mirror, reflecting how societies process violence when certainty is denied. With no arrest, no confession that held, no trial that delivered truth, Villisca transformed from a crime scene into a question mark, suspended across generations. Modern historians who revisited the archives noticed something subtle but important. Over time, the story shifted from facts to interpretations, from evidence to emphasis. Early newspaper accounts focused on the horror itself, the shock that such violence could erupt in a town defined by familiarity and trust. Later retellings emphasized suspects, motives, and theories. Eventually, the house became a character in its own right, absorbing the weight of fear and curiosity that the unanswered crime produced. This evolution reveals a deeper truth about unresolved crimes. When facts fail to conclude a story, meaning rushes in to fill the void. People search for patterns, symbols, and explanations that go beyond what can be proven. In Villisca, that search has never stopped. Consider the killer's final actions inside the house. The covering of mirrors and windows, the draping of cloth over faces, the quiet domestic acts performed after the murders. These details have been analyzed endlessly, yet they resist a single interpretation. To some, they suggest guilt or shame, an inability to confront what had been done. To others, they suggest ritual, control, or even a warped sense of order imposed on chaos. What remains consistent is that these actions were deliberate. Deliberation implies intention, and intention implies a mind that was not simply overwhelmed by rage. This is why many modern criminologists lean toward the conclusion that the Villisca killer was methodical rather than impulsive. He selected a time when the household would be asleep. He disabled communication by cutting the telephone line. He used a weapon that would not immediately draw attention from outside the house. He stayed long enough to ensure death, then longer still to impose a final arrangement on the scene. He left without being seen. None of this guarantees intelligence or sophistication, but it does suggest experience. Whether that experience came from prior crimes, from familiarity with violence, or from a personality shaped by control and secrecy is impossible to say. But the absence of panic is telling. Panic leaves traces. Panic makes mistakes. Panic accelerates departure. The Villisca killer displayed none of these traits. And yet, despite this apparent control, the killer vanished. No credible sightings followed. No confession emerged that could be verified. No later crime was definitively linked. This silence creates one of the most troubling possibilities of all: that the killer may have lived a largely ordinary life afterward. He may have returned to work, to family, to routine. He may have blended back into society so completely that his secret died with him. If that is true, it forces an uncomfortable reckoning. It suggests that extreme violence does not always come with visible warning signs, and that some crimes are committed by individuals who leave no lasting footprint beyond the damage they inflict. As the case aged, it also became a study in investigative limitation. The Villisca murders occurred at a moment in history when modern policing had not yet taken shape. There were no crime scene technicians trained to preserve evidence.
No standardaus d'autapsis.
No national databases.
No saokelagical profiling.
The tools we now take for granted simply did not exist. The result was a kind of investigative paralysis. Each misstep compounded the next. Evidence was handled improperly. Witness statements were contaminated by rumor. Suspects were pursued based on public pressure rather than proof. By the time the system began to correct itself, the damage was irreversible. In this sense, Villisca is not just a story about a killer. It is a story about timing. Had the murders occurred decades later, they might have been solved. Had they occurred decades earlier, they might have faded into obscurity. Instead, they landed in a transitional moment, becoming one of the earliest examples of a modern mystery trapped in a pre-modern system. The human cost of that timing is often overshadowed by the mystery itself. Josiah Moore was more than a businessman caught in a theoretical motive. He was a father, a husband, a man with plans and obligations. Sarah Moore was not simply a victim in a crime narrative. She was a mother who likely woke in the final moments of her life, aware that something was wrong. The Moore children were not symbols or statistics. They were individuals with personalities, fears, and expectations of tomorrow. The Stillinger sisters went to a sleepover and never came home. When a crime remains unsolved, the victims are denied not only justice but context. Their deaths become abstract, discussed in terms of theories rather than lives. This is one of the quiet tragedies of Villisca. The story grows larger while the people at its center grow smaller. In recent years, efforts have been made to restore some of that lost humanity. Historians have reconstructed the daily lives of the Moore family, their routines, their relationships, their place in the community. These reconstructions do not solve the crime, but they remind us what was taken. They ground the mystery in reality. The house on 2nd Street stands today as both a memorial and a provocation. Visitors walk through its rooms knowing exactly what happened there, yet still unable to explain it. Some leave shaken, others leave reflective. A few leave convinced they have experienced something beyond the physical. Regardless of belief, few leave unaffected. That reaction speaks to the power of unresolved violence. It lingers. It seeps into imagination. It refuses to be neatly categorized as past. And perhaps that is the final lesson of Villisca. Not every story has an ending. Not every crime yields a name. Not every question can be answered, no matter how much time passes or how carefully it is examined. The desire for closure is human, but reality does not always accommodate it. The Villisca Axe murders remain open not because investigators failed to try, but because the truth slipped through the cracks of history. It escaped in the hours before dawn, walked away from a quiet White House, and dissolved into a world that was not yet equipped to catch it. What remains is a warning etched into collective memory. Safety can be fragile. Evil does not always announce itself. And sometimes the most terrifying part of a crime is not what we know, but what we never will. More than a century later, the questions still echo through the empty rooms of that house. Who was he? Why did he come? How did he leave? And how did he live afterward, carrying a secret that reshaped a town and outlived everyone who knew the victims by name? The answers, if they ever existed in a form we could grasp, are gone now. All that remains is the story, unfinished and unresolved, waiting in silence for a conclusion that will likely never arrive. And that silence is the true legacy of the Villisca Axe Murders.